Hi, friends, and welcome to week 2 of our study of White Too Long with Rayne Memorial United Methodist Church and St. Charles Avenue Baptist. We are just jumping deep into it this week. So in our video today, it's Pastor Jay Hogwood and Pastor Ed Cooper talking with each other about this section of reading. And you will hear themes around desegregation and integration, bravery and courage, remembering and memory versus history and facts. And then they'll move us towards some conversation around how we mark the things that we remember as a people, statues, monuments. How do we tell the stories of what we're remembering versus the stories of real history as it is? And Pastor Ed Cooper also shares a really, really powerful personal experience from one of the congregations he served along the course of his career. So I hope that in listening to that, it invites you to share some personal stories of your own. And then at some point, Jay will point you towards the bottom of 70. That is the conclusion of the section Remembering for those of you who are reading on Kindle and don't have page numbers. And then this section takes us a little bit into the chapter called Believing, and then that's where we'll stop for this week. So looking forward to seeing you on Tuesday morning at 10 and Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock.
Reverend Ed Cooper, and for my part, Jay Hogwood. Ed and I have held the fort down. Ed, we've missed our peeps, right?
Which we have.
We've missed Ed's very dear spouse, Reverend Joanne Cooper, as well as Reverend Elizabeth Lott, Reverend Sarah Chancellor Watson, our colleagues from the West Bank, as well as the East Bank. So Ed and I have done this thing, really looking at the second section of the readings. And we have talked for a little while and have pointed out, Ed and I both, in our own experiences of desegregation and or integration in our lives personally and also pastorally. So I just mentioned to Ed, the setup question here is what we've read on pages 44 and 45 concerning Jackson, Mississippi, First Baptist Jackson, Mississippi, and Galloway, UMC. And those are important historical notes that Robert Jones gives. We won't narrate those, but it does give us this question. And Ed knows well, as a pastor with a Baptist background and a United Methodist Church present reality, and for me, likewise, a Baptist background and UMC present reality, what it's looked like in the deep South or the Gulf Coast South to pastor. So question, Ed, Reverend Cooper, what has it looked like for you? Meaning desegregation, integration, as you've had some experience in these realities. What comes to your mind from this part of the reading?
Well, it's much like, in some ways, I felt, you feel like you're reading your own story when I'm reading Jones's work. Not just because of his heritage, which there's a real affinity for me because I recognize the names and the places. It's like, gosh, it's a warm, fuzzy feeling because it just feels like old home week in some ways. But yet there's also this underside to it because some of it feels so very familiar. In one, and especially that Mississippi connection, which I've experienced before. There was the being in a Mississippi church where we were not integrated. We did not have Black members, but we did. There were students that attended occasionally, but it wasn't something that was a part of our life. But it never was really. It wasn't an issue. People were polite. It really wasn't. It never became ugly. It wasn't sinister, but no one ever really stepped over the line by saying, I want to become a member. Now, and of course I was young and I And Jay, I've shared this with you before, and it's, we all have our stories. We all have our stuff. I wished I had been more brave. I wished I'd been more courageous. But those are things I have to live with. And I hope I'm more courageous today and more brave. But I didn't push the issue. I was accepting, but I probably could have done more.
And
Yeah,
what years would that have been?
that would have been in the early 80s. And so it was, but again, I did not have the courage of a Dr. W.B. Selah, or Selah, however he pronounced that, the Galloway United Methodist, which I just admire his story, where he had his letter of resignation tucked in his jacket. He was ready to go. If his church took actions to say, I'm sorry, students of color, you're not coming into our church, he was saying, then I am not the pastor for you. And you know what, Jay, when I read that, I want to believe, honestly, see, I never had that to happen where the church actually said, no, you cannot join. And I'm hoping and praying that there was something within me that would have said, even as a young pastor, that would have said, no, then I'm not the pastor for you either. But I never was pushed to that point. But I honestly don't think I could have stayed in that situation. I don't know, because that takes me to my other situation. And I did leave a church because of something much, much like that. And that was, I was pastoring a church in Memphis, where we were in a neighborhood that was in transition, poor white, poor Hispanic, poor African American. And I thought the church really wanted to reach the neighborhood. And so I took them at their word, and we started reaching those folks, the people around the church. And then at one of the functions, there were some children of color, brown and black, and a person, a woman, said, and I know this is going to sound horrible, and I even hate, but she said it. I heard it. I will forever remember it. She said, if I had a rope, I would tie it around their neck and drag every one of them out of this fellowship hall. She actually said it. And that was pretty much summed up the attitude of that church. And within a short time, I said, I'm not the pastor for this congregation.
And were those churches, I appreciate these stories greatly, because it sounds like this was, this is the early 80s to the late 80s and 90s.
And that was 93.
And so you've got, as I recall you saying, the first episode or those storylines are Oxford, Mississippi.
Yes.
And then that most recent story you said was Memphis?
Memphis, yes.
I hear you.
And so that's kind of so those were and then there were experiences all in between. And I knew that I pastored churches as a college student in the early 70s, and a seminary student that we never had people of color to visit. And I knew probably in my college church, which would have been in Central Louisiana, that probably would not have been welcomed at all. And that's a long time ago, Jay. But so it's been it's been much like what he's describing here in this in his book.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I think, as we mentioned earlier, this section for the greater part of this assignment in our reading is about remembering, and remembering is hard, and it's the difference between what's history and what we remember in memory. There is that, which is a whole other thing we could talk about, and monuments. Now, some of that he gets into in the next section, But monuments, when we historicize, when we monumentalize, memorialize heroes of the past in Southern contexts, those statues, of course, as we know in our city with Mayor Landrew, right before my appointment here in 2017, Ed, so just a few years before you came, and you know this history because you know this area well, how bold an action by Mayor Landrew at the time to address memorializing memory, and how that can be sometimes very different history remembered. Now we're talking Brueggemann, history remembered and the actual historical situation. Those can be for different things. That said, before we end our time together, as far as just this priming the well for conversation, I was really struck, and I think we've mentioned this before in other conversations. It's page 71. I think it's the very end of this chapter. When Jones mentions this conclusion, it's the subsection, a moment of reckoning is upon us. And it's time that we white Christians do better to see what is plainly in front of us and to wrestle with the unsettling implications. What if the racist views of historical titans of the faith infected the entire theological project contemporary white Christians have inherited from top to bottom? That is the end of this section of our reading, and I am deeply challenged. You've alluded to this several weeks ago, Ed, in conversations, and it is, without doubt, what would we say? Welcoming this time of reckoning, and to be in families of faith, congregations like you are at Boynton and Aurora, like I am at Rayne, and like our colleagues are, as we mentioned earlier, in different faith communities who are at least open to that reckoning, not knowing how it's going to shape out, but posturing ourselves as followers of Jesus.
Yes.
In the power of the Spirit. You mentioned this earlier in our conversation, to be open to the inspiration for repentance, for change, for something that is restoring to our brothers and sisters of who are Black and brown bodies, who are Black, African American folk, and others. It's powerful. So I'm glad to walk the journey with you, and I think as we continue as clergy colleagues in the next few weeks, we'll address more of these things. But hopefully, to our groups watching this, whenever you're watching it, we'll also feel together our own memories, painful as they might be, that might point us into a direction that is of healing and restoration and reconciliation. So Reverend Cooper, thank you.
Thank you, Jay.
At this point, I'm going to end this. I will end this recording now, and God's peace.